not sure which one. Okay, so I'm just going to start live streaming. Hello, everyone. Welcome. Thank you for joining us. We are just going to give everyone a few minutes. We're going to start in 5 minutes. Just give everyone a chance to join us, and then we'll begin in 5 minutes. Right, so we should be going on Facebook as well, live on Facebook as well. Okay, I think we're live on Facebook. We're live to our audience, and just a couple more minutes and we'll start. Thank you to everyone who's already joined us and is waiting patiently. We will begin at 2:05 exactly. In the meantime, I'd just like to bring everyone's attention to the poll we've got going, just to get an understanding of how you as women, I think mostly we have women who are attending. Unfortunately, we would have liked more men to attend as well. But we've got a poll on there on how you as a woman feel inequality has impacted your mental health. So just we can get a bit of a, I will launch it. Sorry, it wasn't launched. So I think you should be able to see the poll now and you should be able to answer it. So just as a way for us to get to know you as an audience and how your experience has been in terms of inequality. And there is also a Q&A box where you can put your questions, which we will come to right towards the end. About 10 minutes at the end, we will open up the floor to participants to ask questions to our panelists. So if you've got any questions, you can put them in the Q&A box. We've got a chat box as well where you can put your comments, etc. You should be able to put some comments on there. Right. So we've got some answers to the poll coming in as well. Okay, so let's start. All right. Welcome everyone to Bayview High School's 3rd annual Mental Health Day event. For the last 3 years since we launched the Emotional Wellbeing Department in 2019, we've been hosting an event on World Mental Health Day, the 10th of October, in a bid to promote and highlight important topics around mental health. We are very grateful to the school, to Bayview High School and its management to give, a platform to be able to raise awareness about these topics. Today's event and the theme for Mental Health Day this year is Mental Health in an Unequal World. So today we will be talking about how inequality impacts spheres of society, mental health and the mental health of not just children, but men, women, vulnerable groups as well, and adolescents. So that's what the event is going to be about. We've got 3 segments. So today's first segment is this webinar, this panel on women's mental health and inequality. We've got a second segment at 3:30 and a third segment at 5 p.m. as well, which will be our last segment. My name is Areed Jafrani, and I head the emotional well-being department at the school. I'm a child and adolescent psychologist, and it's just been such a pleasure to build this department up and to do all the work that we've been able to do to raise awareness and to promote the mental health of our staff, our students, and just get everyone involved in the community to promote the well-being of children and adults as well. So the department actually works on promoting and supporting the mental health of our community members. And we've been doing this for 3 years now. We've got interventions where we provide therapy and therapeutic support to our students, while at the same time, we also implement projects that promote the well-being so that children and the community members don't end up developing mental health difficulties. So that's kind of the aim of the department. Today's topic for this segment is women's mental health in an unequal world. We do know that patriarchy and inequality impacts women. Research shows, and I think a lot of women's lived experiences show that it impacts their mental health significantly. So we wanted to use this platform, considering that is the theme for this year. We wanted to use this platform to raise awareness about how inequality impacts women. So we've got an esteemed panel here today. I'm really, really excited to hear from each one of them. Our first speaker is Samra Zafar, who is an award-winning international speaker, best-selling author, and social entrepreneur who advocates for equity, inclusion, mental health, and human rights. She has been recognized as one of Canada's top 100 most powerful women by Women's Executive Network in 2019 and top 25 inspirational women in Canada. After escaping a decade of abuse living as a child bride in Canada, she pursued her education as a single mother, working with multiple jobs, and completed her bachelor's and master's degree in economics from the University of Toronto. We are really, really grateful to you, Samra, for joining us. Welcome.
Thank you so much. So happy to be here.
Thank you. Next, we have Maliha Ziya Lari, who holds an LLM in International Protection of Human Rights from the School of Oriental and African Studies. She is an advocate of the High Court and has practiced in Islamabad and Karachi with a primary focus on criminal, family, constitutional, and human rights law. She is a trained legislative drafter and gender and law trainer and published researcher with experience at the national and provincial levels. She currently holds the position of Associate Director at the Legal Aid Society. She is a gender and law specialist who has worked extensively on issues related to discrimination and violation of human rights of marginalized and vulnerable communities, including women, religious minorities, and transgenders, with a particular focus on gender-based violence. Thank you, Maliha, for being here and joining us today. We are really happy you could join us, and you will be sharing your expertise with us today. I do think Maliha is here. I think the third panelist has her video off. I think
yes.
But she is here. She is here. I think there's a bit of an internet issue happening at her end, but she is here. She is listening to us, rest assured. All right, and our last but not the least, Nirmal Nyazi, who we hold very close to our heart. She's been at the school last year as well. She's worked with us, and I'm really happy to have her here. She is a clinical psychologist with 8 years of experience. She works as a consultant for various organizations while running her own practice, Let's Talk Mind. She is a member of the Pakistan Association of Clinical Psychologists and an affiliate member of American Psychological Association. Her expertise lies with assessments and diagnostics as well as psychotherapy. She takes an inclusive approach to mental health and uses evidence-based treatment modalities. Welcome, Nirmal, and welcome to all of our panelists. So before waiting further, we're going to start with Samra. We're going to get our question started. So Samra, first of all, my question is to you. Can you define how the world, specifically the Pakistani society and culture right now is set up that it creates inequality?
That's such a great question. And I know I'm going to try to keep it concise because I could go on and on about that. But, when you think about a gender unequal world, and when you think about patriarchal norms and dogma and rituals that really propagate inequality, it starts from the very beginning. It starts even, especially when we look at the Pakistani culture and society, right? You know what happens when a boy is born? People are like, wow, I'll transgress to Urdu a little bit because I think it's just more effective. Ke hamara beta doctor banega, engineer banega, and all of that, right? My son will grow up to be all of those things. And when a girl is born, the first thing that comes out, Allah mi iski naseeb achhe kare, right? It's like as if finding a good husband is the only purpose of a woman's life. Like from day one, as soon as she's born, that is the ultimate destiny that is placed on her. So and as she grows up, she is the honor, the izzat of her father, her family, her brother, and then eventually her husband and her children and her susral and her in-laws. But what about her own honor? What about her own individuality, right? We tie a woman's honor to the way she dresses, to her marital status, her ability to bear children, whether or not she has a failed marriage or not. So like even the whole blame of a marriage failing is placed on a woman's head. So when a woman walks away from abuse, like I did, women are the ones who are ostracized and marginalized, that she failed at the real purpose of being a woman, no matter how accomplished she might be in other areas of her life. But that is basically the responsibility that is placed on her from day one, that she holds the honor of everybody in her hands, but she is never honored for who she is as an individual, as a complete being in herself, rather than as an attachment to somebody else through some kind of a gender-based patriarchal relationship. And that propagates itself in all cultures. Patriarchy is very much universal, and violence against women and gender-based violence is very much universal. My work is very international, and I see the same stories everywhere. But the barriers and the shame and stigma that exists in our culture is much more elevated. So even though abuse may happen to, let's say, a white woman and a Pakistani woman, and I'm a Pakistani woman living in Canada, and I'm doing a lot of this work there, so I see it happening in all spectrums. But when a white woman might leave abuse, or when she might go and pursue her own dreams or her own career or something, she goes against sort of the so-called norms, she's often applauded and supported. Whereas when a Pakistani woman does that, she is ostracized and put down and ridiculed. And like the support will come from a handful of people, but that's not the majority. So it starts at a very young age, and then it basically is the conditioning that happens over decades and decades. And that's why so many girls will have self-esteem issues around, that unke rishte nahi aa rahe, or or they're being rejected by marriage proposals, or they're like, the girls who are being picked up as young brides are applauded as if there's some kind of an accomplishment. And less emphasis is placed on a woman and who she is as an individual, rather than the role that she fulfills as somebody's wife, daughter, whatever. So I think, that environment is what really is the perfect petri dish and the perfect breeding ground for gender inequality.
Yeah. And what you said is really powerful, that we don't honor women, or we don't honor a girl as an individual. We always see, even if we call out inequality, or we call out violence against women or girls, there's often this, ये किसी की माँ है, ये किसी की बहन है, तुमने ये क्यों नहीं सोचा कि तुम्हारे घर में तुम्हारी बहन के साथ ये होता, तो how would you feel? So it's not about, even if you are calling out those issues in society, it's because that woman or that girl is an extension of someone else, is seen as an extension of someone else, rather than her own individual person. And I think you're right, it starts from the earliest of ages when a child is born, to how it goes on with how they're raised, in the different ways that they're raised, a boy and a girl are raised. So thank you so much for that, Samra. I think that really sums it up really well. Maliha, my next question is to you. Can you please add on to that from your experience of working in the legal sector and as an activist against gender-based violence? If you could just add on from your experience to what Samra said.
No, completely agree with everything that Samra said. It's very much a cultural, particularly when it comes to violence and the types of violence that women face. Now, whether we talk about things as extreme as honor killing, where a woman is murdered under the guise, under the name of honor because उसकी इज्जत खानदान की इज्जत लूट ली है. There's an idea कि बेहतर है कि वो मर जाए. Even things such as rape. I was regularly conduct trainings on rape and domestic violence, and everyone says rape is worse than murder. Rape is worse than death because uski izzat lootna is considered the worst thing possible. So it's better that she dies rather than she survives. That's actually the mindset of a lot of people. Like, just to move on to even lesser degrees of violence, what is considered lesser degrees of violence or heinous crimes such as domestic violence, child marriage, etc. The constant, there's two aspects to it. One is the vulnerability. Why does so much violence happen, particularly to women and the girl child? This comes back कि हमारे माशरे में हम देखते हैं कि there's a vulnerability created because एक बच्ची पैदा इसकी परवरिश करनी है, we have to be careful, उसको घर से ना अकेले जाने दें. You kind of disenfranchise her to a point where she is dependent on the men. Whether it comes from spending more money on the boys' education than the girls' education, whether it's public spaces or lack of public spaces. कि उसको जा सकते, गाड़ी नहीं चला सकती, late night नहीं जा सकती, इधर नहीं कर सकती, shouldn't work in. I mean, I remember when I was doing law, there was a lot of people कि how can you do criminal law? ये तो औरतों का काम नहीं है. Are you going to talk to murderers? Are you going to talk to thieves? Are you going to talk to the police? So there's this constant thing about what is a woman's role? Accepted role hai kya? The gender roles. Wife, mother to hai definitely, but even in the professional world, teacher is okay, a gynae nurse, a doctor might be okay. So there's very much a streamline of what is acceptable for women's behavior. But that goes also into conflict resolution as well. Okay, as girls, we are taught not to raise our voice. As women, it's even more so because anyone who raises her voice is considered to be unrefined. So how do you deal with your fights? How do you deal with somebody who is being aggressive towards you? अगर आप ऊंची जबान ज्यादा aggressive जबान इस्तेमाल करें, ऊंची आवाज इस्तेमाल करें, you are still to blame. अच्छी औरत नहीं है, look at her, she's so aggressive, look at her, she's so rough, she's so this, she's so that. वो सही तरीके से handle नहीं करती.
Absolutely.
And things such as harassment. A woman yelling back at someone who's harassing her, it's not a norm. But then they're blamed if they don't do that as well. So it's kind of like a double dichotomy. And then it goes into the homes as well. You're not allowed to speak about elders ke khilaf aap baat nahi kar sakte, which leads to so many cases of sexual abuse. I mean, I mean, not to such an extreme, but I see I have 3 children below the age of 7, and I'm sure we've all experienced this. Is that there'll always be some uncle or aunt who'll come and say, "Mujhe aakar puppy do," and everyone will get offended if the child is told. हमारे माशरे में ये भी है कि बड़ों के साथ you can't say no, particularly girls. लड़का तो करे दे, लड़का तो लड़का है. So you kind of see that kind of conflict resolution not being able to do it. And कि कभी घर से बाहर बात ना निकालें. So it comes into that. But also the men then are taught conflict resolution in a very violent way. Lado, mard bano. There's this concept of masculinities as well. So whereas women are told not to fight, the men are told to be physically violent. And फिर उसके साथ साथ women are ये नाजुक है, रोने का मसला नहीं है, औरतें तो ऐसी होती हैं, but the men on the other hand are told कि मर्द बनो, मर्द तो नहीं रोते, लड़के तो नहीं रोते. So then there comes this whole repression of emotion and anger. Women are taught to sort out their feelings, men are not. So it it becomes this really awful dichotomy at a later stage where the only emotion acceptable from men is aggression and anger. And that's the only way they know how to deal with conflict and how to deal with their emotions. And women, on the other hand, are taught to stay silent and accept that kind of anger. And then when we come into the legal world, the cases that we see are very often the cases where women don't have any other option. I think nobody comes to law or the court unless they have no other choice. So we see women who are not being able to deal with the situation anymore. You see cases where of extreme violence, and their families are not being supportive, or they don't know how to be supportive. Because apart from just the violence, the additional aspect and problem that comes is the economic disenfranchisement of women. Okay, expecting a woman to give up her job when she's had children is the norm.
Yeah.
Shadi ho rahi hai, a woman is expected to stop working 3-4 months in advance because shadi ki tiyari. How is she going to maintain the house after she's gotten married? How is she going to maintain the house after she's had children? What are you going to do with those children? So, all of these things means that as a lot, women also then, if they're working and professional women, also then end up taking breaks in their career, which impacts their ability to negotiate within the family, or even within a marriage, or within their own spaces. Not to mention, if you go further back, is education bhi nahi hoti for a lot of women. Ki maybe if they get educated, secondary education nahi hoti, college nahi hoti, there's a whole other variety. So economically disenfranchised, society may they're taught not to necessarily rock the boat or take a step out of what is considered ordinary. It becomes a very, very unequal situation. And for women, as I completely agree what Samra said, is that when women do try to break that, women are always told कि नहीं मर्द तो ऐसे ही होते हैं, औरतों को ज़्यादा compromise करना होता है. औरत का काम है कि घर घर को इकट्ठा रखे. And then when you break out of that marriage, you're like कि उसने तो बाप है, बेहतर है कि माँ बाप इकट्ठे रहें. क्यों छोड़ा उसने? How is she going to look after the children? So it's always blamed on the woman, questioned on the woman. And very often she can't. I know so many women, clients and other women who are spoken to, who stay in marriages because they can't afford not to be in those marriages financially, or from a cultural or social basis. So it becomes a very, very difficult situation. Then, of course, the associated mental pressures and tortures as well, which comes back to the topic of today as well. That kind of, apart from the physical violence, the psychological effect of just constantly having to maintain this facade, and in cases of violence, how to deal with it. From a very young age, sexual harassment is a norm for us. How do you deal with that? What does that make a child or a girl feel about her body as she's growing up? So that's.
So it sounds like it's a very systematic issue. It's institutionalized. It's not only the messages that women and children and girls and boys are receiving from early on, but it's also how entrenched that inequality is in our systems, in our family systems, in our workplaces, in the court system, in the legal system. Even in the in the way that children are taught at schools as well, it becomes an issue around that. How just the way students are talked to as well. So it's a very systematic issue, and it's very institutionalized, and I guess it will take a lot of work. But the first point is that we start talking about it, which is what we are, a lot of people are starting to do, and which is what we're here for as well, to start a debate, to start a conversation about how it impacts women's mental health. In the poll, we've got 66% of women today who've said that as a woman they feel inequality has impacted their mental health. Which brings me to Nirmal, your question. Can you speak from your experiences of working with women, as a psychologist, how this inequality plays out in their lives and in the lives of their children and their families?
So just listening into all that was being talked about, it made me really think back to all the work that I have been doing. I could actually see faces of many of my clients as well. And the presence of this kind of discrimination presents itself in very subtle ways as well. Like I had, as you had introduced, I do assessments and diagnostics as well, right? That's early intervention. That's the idea that the earliest it's possible to identify there are some concerns coming up, the right help can be provided. I initially thought that was a coincidence. I thought that that's something weird, but one day I was just going through my data of all the reports that I would have conducted, and they're like crossing over 200, 300, because I've been doing it for such a long time. More than that, actually. And I realized that maximum percentage was boys. So children, young children, if they have autism or ADHD, boys would be coming in, parents would be super concerned. क्या progress हो सकती है, किस तरह से हो सकता है. And family में जब आप explore करते हो, family history ले रहे होते हो, आपको पता चल रहा होता है, अच्छा learning disability तो बच्ची में भी नजर आ रही है. आपने बेटी की assessment नहीं कराई, कभी उससे नहीं वो तो है थोड़ी सी quiet सी है. इतना misdiagnosis हो रहा होता है कि ADHD शायद सिर्फ boys में हो सकता है, because apparently hyperactivity can only be associated with boys. हालांकि बच्चियों की presence of ADHD, presentation of ADHD is very different. So एक medical attention की जब हम बात कर रहे होते हैं, mental health medical attention की बात कर रहे होते हैं, उसमें भी from a very young age, you can see actually trends. Clear trend starts to emerge where the access for such services is not actually extended to female or girl children, basically. I remember distinctively कि बच्चे के और बच्चियों के अंदर autism खास तौर पे बहुत quickly miss out होता है, because बच्चियां तो जरूरी है ना कि quiet हों, disconnected हों, बिल्कुल अपने अपने काम से काम रखें, ज़्यादा नहीं बोलें. तो बड़े सटल तरीके से बहुत सारी चीज़ें जो हम बॉयज़ में बड़ी प्रेजेंट हो जाती हैं, बच्चों में नहीं हो रही होती. यही चीज़ अगर मैं अभी रिसेंट इवेंट्स के साथ बात करूँ, अभी रिसेंटली पाकिस्तान की जो फीमेल पॉपुलेशन है, काफ़ी मतलब बैक टू बैक शॉक्स हमारे साथ बहुत सारे हुए. पर्सनली ऑल्सो वी ऑल वर टच्ड, राइट? And I remember taking supervision particularly because going in sessions was such a challenge where clients who had been sexually assaulted, who experienced domestic violence, who did not even, like they belonged to like relatively safer environments, but had different sort of mental health challenges. But a lot was shaken up based on so many cases that had emerged, especially the recent one, Noor incident, and the reaction that the public then gives. It's not just that incident, it's the reaction. So what starts to happen for a therapist, like from a therapist perspective, if I was to say, I remember asking that for my supervisor was that our job is to help our clients explore resources to help them to cope. But when the problem lies with the system, it's a systemic approach. It's the systemic problem, like you had highlighted also, that it's the problem that's lying with the institution. Where do we go? What do I tell my client? How do I encourage them? Okay, these are your resources. Because we talk about the circle of control, the outer circle of control, with things. So there's so much that the women of our society cannot control. It is so much, like basic से basic चीजें जो आपका अपना एक right बनता है, आप नहीं कर सकते हो, तो ये conversation बहुत मुख्तलिफ हो जाती है, बहुत मुश्किल होती है. So I actually had to sit down with my clients to talk about that they need to understand कि उनका अपने personal feeling नहीं है, उनकी अपनी ये उनकी lack of capability नहीं है कि वो cope नहीं कर सकते, but there are no resources for them to cope. So that helps them to identify, because ये हम लोगों में इतना ingrained होता है कि हमें लगता है कि ये problems हमने ही solve करनी है, because as a woman that is what we're taught, right? Like आप जैसे Samra and Maliha both were highlighting that is what you're supposed to do. You're the problem solver of the family. घर में लड़ाई हो रही है, आपने diffuse करनी है, आप add नहीं कर सकते, protest नहीं कर सकते. अगर abuse घर में चल रहा है तो लड़के के पास जॉब लेके दूसरी सिटी में चले जाने की पॉसिबिलिटी और प्रोबेबिलिटी ज्यादा होती है, बच्ची नहीं जा सकती. मेरे पास खुद के इतने केसेस मौजूद हैं जहाँ पे एब्यूजिव पेरेंट्स हैं, भाई जा चुका है, बेटी नहीं जा सकती बिकॉज बेटी का अपना गिल्ट, अगर उसकी अपॉर्चुनिटी आ भी रही है, वो अगर लकीली इनफ अगर प्रिविलेज बैकग्राउंड से है भी, पर उसका अपना गिल्ट कि मैं पेरेंट्स को कैसे छोड़ दूँ. So while working with clients particularly, it becomes really challenging because there are such limited resources available for them to utilize in order to have some sort of relief. And that also plays out very negatively in terms of how we create our own identities as well. And even from like, I'm now talking about from two different perspectives. एक हम बात करें privileged society की, हम और आप की अगर मैं बात करूं, so we are very privileged, right? We are acknowledging that. But even then we realize and understand कि अगर मुझे यहाँ पे निकल के सड़क के उस पार जाना है, मैं अपनी मर्जी से नहीं कर सकती, because अगर रास्ते में खुदा ना खास्ता कुछ हो गया तो I will be the one to be blamed. रात को मगरिब के बाद नहीं निकल सकती, क्या सोचा था मैंने, राइट? या अगर मेरी कोई चीज चोरी हो गई, आजकल ये बड़ा हो रहा है कि लोग सोशल मीडिया पे आके बोलते हैं, लेकिन वहां पे भी प्रोटेस्ट करने के लिए भी, इन ऑर्डर टू टॉक अबाउट दीज थिंग्स, आई कांट डू दैट. अब अगर मैं सिर्फ और सिर्फ क्लिनिकल डायग्नोसिस के पर्सपेक्टिव से ही बात अगर कर रही हूँ, a lot of times I had been asked to hide a diagnosis because नहीं ये तो हो ही नहीं सकता, अब शादी कैसे हो, शादी हो नहीं, बच्ची का तो फ्यूचर खत्म हो गया, इसका तो ये चीज नहीं चाहिए, इसकी शादी हो सकती है, एज अपोज टू अगर बेटे से रिलेटेड अगर बात हो रही होगी तो उसकी जॉब का, उसकी करियर प्रोग्रेशन का, उसको ज्यादा, इसको छोड़ दें, इसके ऊपर ज्यादा फोकस कर दें. I've had siblings come in where the parents would rather and not because they're doing this out of some sort of like evil intention, it's not that. It's so deeply rooted in our society that girls and women are not particularly seen very clearly. They're very faded. And that is what's seen during counseling process as well. Because oftentimes आपके पास या तो fight का होता है response या flight का होता है. जब आप भाग नहीं सकते, लड़ नहीं सकते, तो आप freeze कर जाते हो. और बहुत सारी औरतों के साथ जब आप काम कर रहे होते हो ना, तो आप realize करते हो कि उनकी अपने defense mechanisms complete तौर पे वो रुक चुकी होती हैं. कुछ अगर जैसे होती हैं, जैसे फॉर एग्जांपल डाइवोर्स के प्रोसेस से गुजर रही है, हमारा अपना लीगल सिस्टम right now also, like back a while back I was working with few women who were pursuing divorce का process. उनका divorce का process इतना brutal नहीं, मतलब जो किसी को छोड़ने का, relationship की disintegration is very painful, right? वो उनके लिए इतना painful नहीं था जितना कि जो legal process है वो गुजरे. So mentally अगर मैं देखूं उस टाइम पे जो मेरा काम था, वो था to how to support this client through the brutality of the system, rather than help them to talk about that they're losing a life partner, their house is for, like they're genuinely, and चाहे कितना ही क्यों कुछ ना हो, हमारा एक बड़ा मिसकंसेप्शन आता है, एक तो डाइवोर्स एक्सेप्टेबल नहीं होगी, और डाइवोर्स की ग्रीविंग अगर आ गई ना, तो मारता था ना, या तो बुरा था, तो तुम क्यों इस बात को रोना रो रही हो. मतलब औरत के लिए आपके पास किसी किस्म का इमोशन जस्टिफाइड नहीं होता. So it becomes really difficult to help our clients to kind of really come to terms and actually validate their experiences, because invalidation is a big part of our growing up process also, very significantly so.
Yeah.
So that brings up, it's a very big challenge.
Thank you, Nirmal. I think some of the things that really came out for me and was linking it back to what Samra had said about how girls or women are taught that their entire purpose in life is to get married, and to just agar shadi ho gayi to sab ho gaya, regardless of what all their achievements have been. And it's so interesting to see how that plays out in the access to care that they might get or not get. Ke agar diagnosis ho gaya, to maybe she might not be able to get married, or agar learning difficulty hai, to why spend all of that money or resources or time or investment into helping her through that learning difficulty, because ultimately she's supposed to get married. So what is she going to do by, getting support in that? So it's really interesting to hear how that actually plays out in the lives of real women and real people. And when we hear these things out on social media or see it in the media, it doesn't seem so relatable. But when we hear real stories, you can see that this isn't just happening in some dystopian world. This is happening right now in our society still, unfortunately. So thank you for sharing that, Nirmal. Maliha, my next question is to you, which is, there are some ways in which the inequality shows up overtly and glaringly. Like you can tell that that's what's happening, that there is inequality and someone's being treated unequally. And then there are some experiences of inequality that aren't as obvious, जो हमारे systems में इतने ingrained होते हैं, या हमारे culture में इतने ingrained होते हैं. So can you define some of those and the type of impact it can have on the mental health of women, the ones that are not so obvious?
Let me give you a very concrete answer in response to your question. This comes from, I'll give an example, very, very specific example. When there's a concept now that, of course, and when we speak to many men, we say, okay, nay, women now work, they're in the workplace, they're professional, they're very good. We've created that space. So we see more women in various different professions. And celebrated, etc. But what remains invisible is still the additional work that women have to do at home to make all of that possible. Whether it is still being in charge, and it's not physically, because everyone says nahi inki maasiyat to hoti hai, inki ye bhi hota hai, inka wo bhi hota hai. But it's not just it's taking care of the house, the khana pina, the children, responsibilities that women continue to have at home in addition to their professional life. So the problem that happens is that you're neither here nor there. So the women who are professional are then sometimes looked down upon from a societal point of view for not being the ideal mother. And the women who are then not managing their home successfully, so to say, supposedly are then looked down, okay, she's not good, she's not a good wife, ye to, her husband's going to leave her, all of that, etc. And so it becomes very, very difficult and challenging mentally. And sometimes it's not about the physical work. So for example, you might have the maid, you might have all of that, but who does the planning? Who does the decision making? Who decides what groceries are coming in, what has to be cooked, all of that, etc. The burden predominantly remains on women. And you'll see the strangest results after that. I'm very lucky in the sense is that my husband and I are very equal partners, but we constantly see the impact of it on society. So for example, as I said, I have 3 children. So my husband drops them to school and he picks them up because, his office is more flexible. He is closer to school. So this year when my twins started going, there were people who said, oh, I think there's to drop them and pick them up. So it there was no concept that maybe the mother is working. It automatically meant that if the woman is not there, she's dead. You see other things where I travel a lot for work and my husband doesn't. And there would be comments, especially particularly in the early years of our marriage, maybe Maliha is having an affair somewhere. Oh, why does she keep traveling to Islamabad and staying in hotels? I'm sure there's something going on over there. And then my husband would always stand up and why should he have had to? If he was the one traveling, there would be no comments.
Yeah.
If I was the one who was dropping the children, there would be no comments. But we constantly see little examples of things such as this.
Yeah.
So it's this kind of invisibility, and no matter how equal or a relationship is or as part of my affect me. It hits you. It's so I mean maybe does not impact me as much, but other women it might, who may not have as supportive structures. So that constant pressure will always be there. Example of one kind of thing, where we constantly see this kind of mental pressures that continue.
Okay, so that's a really good example, Maliha, that even though there are, we have taken a couple of steps forward in a very obvious way, like there are more women in the workforce, there are more women going out of their houses, but at the same time, there's a lot more, there is still a lot of those expectations, a lot of those comments that are made on women, some very obviously, some very glaringly, and some in very undertones and very hushed tones, but we know exactly what they're trying to imply. And we're really, honored and privileged that you are able to share your own experiences with us, and that you've been able to, feel comfortable enough to share how it's impacted you and how those, comments have been made to you as well. So thank you for that, Maliha. Samra, now I'd like to come to you, and you've also talked a lot about your own experiences of gender-based violence. And if you feel comfortable, can you please share some of your own experiences and the type of impact it had on your mental health, how you combated it, and how would you say the place where you're at now?
Absolutely. And I've been listening with so much concentration to what Maliha and Nirmal have been talking about it. It's really resonating on such a personal level, because the whole spectrum of violence, and when you think of the word violence, हमारे यहाँ culture में क्या होता है, violence is defined as physical abuse. It's defined as, you know, थप्पड़ मार रहे हैं, हड्डियां तोड़ रहे हैं, and all of that. But actually, violence comes from the word violation, right? And any kind of violation against you and your own autonomy is violence, whether it is verbal, emotional, psychological, financial, anything that is a violation of your human right to freedom and safety and dignity is violence. And oftentimes that violence is non-physical. It's emotional, verbal, like I said, and uski to koi baat hi nahi karta, because, you know, like, are ye to aadmi hai, aadmi to isi tarah kehte rehte, right? And what Nirmal was also saying about how men and boys are raised to be to suppress their emotions, and you know, Maliha was talking about the only emotion that is acceptable is anger and aggression, and that is so true, because, you know, what is the biggest trait of an abuser, an abusive personality, is lack of empathy. And empathy comes from emotional disconnectedness. So if somebody is emotionally disconnected, if they can't even understand their own emotions, how are they going to have empathy for someone else's emotions and their autonomy, right? And that's sort of what happens. So I'm going to come back to my own experiences. You know, like, I grew up in Abu Dhabi, but I'm, you know, originally from Karachi. I was born in Karachi, and we spent a lot of time in Pakistan. And, you know, even though we were in Abu Dhabi, we were very much a Pakistani family among Pakistani culture and Pakistani communities. And as I was growing up, there were many, many instances of, you know, koi uncle chhu rahe hain, koi Quran padhane wale qazi sahab chhu rahe hain, you know, all this kind of stuff, which sadly happens to a lot of girls in our culture, but there is a hush-hush about it, because you're not supposed to talk about it, right? Or if there was one time, for example, I even told my mother that some family friend had touched me and groped me, and my mother said, oh, pata hai, tum bas bahut jaldi badi ho rahi ho. So, you know, then the next time when they went to their house, I was told to stay home and not go. So it was as if it was, so I couldn't meet my friends who were like that, you know, and I couldn't mingle with the family. So it was, bas kisi ko batana nahi, kisi ko pata na chale. So it's basically, you know, ingrained in a girl's mind that if somebody is violating her, that's her fault, and she needs to stay quiet, because if someone finds out, it's going to be a tainted kind of dhaba on her, you know. So that's sort of what happened to me as a child. And I learned that I don't have autonomy over my own body and over my own being. And silence is like the biggest and most prized virtue of being a girl. So then, you know, as I grew up, and suddenly I had this, my mother came into my room when I was in grade 11, and I was doing my math homework, and she told me that there is a marriage proposal for me. And at that point, I mean, I was 16 years old, right? And I had no desire to get married. And I was not one of those girls, जैसे होता है, you know, हमारे यहाँ मेरी cousins थी और लोग थे, और you know, और friends भी कि शादी हो जाए, बस शादी, मुझे शादी करनी है। हमारे यहाँ तो बचपन से यही सिखाया जाता है ना कि शादी is the best day of your life and that's the ultimate goal of your life. तो लड़कियां बड़े होते हुए भी conditioned इतनी होती है कि वही ख्वाब देखती होती है कि हमने शादी पे जोड़ा कौन सा पहनना है, right? But I was a bit of an anomaly. When I grew up, I was dreaming about Harvard and Stanford, and I was always a straight A student, and I was very, very ambitious. So, but I'm the eldest of 4 girls. तो सब लोग बड़े होते हुए यही बोल रहे होते थे कि हाँ ठीक है, ख्वाब देखो, बस ये ना सोचो कि वो पूरे होंगे, ये मत भूल, you know. And everybody was around me would tell my parents, 4 बेटियां हैं, समरा की शादी के बारे में सोचो, कैसे 4 बेटियों के लिए शादी करनी है, as if like girls are a burden, right? So this kind, and then, you know, I'm very tall, and I have fairer kind of a skin, so इसके तो रिश्ते आराम से मिल जाएंगे, गोरी है बस लंबी ज्यादा ना हो, वरना लड़के नहीं मिलेंगे, you know. और ज्यादा पढ़ाई करोगी तो थोड़ी इतनी पढ़ाई होनी चाहिए कि रिश्ता अच्छा आ जाए, मगर बहुत ज्यादा नहीं, क्योंकि फिर जो है ना लड़कों से ज्यादा पढ़ लोगी तो फिर वो भी प्रॉब्लम है, right? So these are the kinds of things I grew up hearing. And even, you know, there were times when my uncles and aunts and all would tell my parents कि इसको डॉक्टर के पास लेके जाओ, इसके दवा कोई दो कि इसकी height रुके, because I'm 5'9" and I had like a growth spurt in my teens, so I was very tall. So suddenly when this rishta came, the most important thing that everybody looked at was that he was 6'2", और बस इतना लंबा लड़का दोबारा नहीं मिलेगा, बस फौरन शादी कर दो, देखो तस्वीरों में कितने अच्छे लगेंगे, you know. And he was 11 years older than me. So, you know, and now when I'm at the age of 39, 11 years is not that big of a deal, but when you're 16, you're a child, right? And 11 years is like a whole generation gap. Like I was not even developed mentally and emotionally enough to make that decision for myself. So everybody was like, and when I tried to resist कि मुझे नहीं करनी शादी and I want to go to school and I want to get an education, so everybody was like, oh, you've gotten, you're the luckiest girl among all of your cousins, you're getting to the real purpose of being a girl, like, bana mat karna rishte ko, Allah miyan bahut guna denge, and you're gonna be ungrateful and all of that. So even though I tried to resist, over like few weeks and months, my voice muted, and I just said, okay, I didn't want to be labeled as an ungrateful and like a badtameez ladki who's like not listening to her elders, right? So the next thing I know, just after my 17th birthday, main dulhan bani hui hu, and I'm sitting beside this man who was an absolute stranger. I had never met him before, and he was now my caretaker, or like he was now my malik, so to speak, or my husband, right? Like ab bas yahi tumhari duniya hai, right? So, and then I went to Canada because he already lived in Canada. His family, like, basically, unhone rishta diya tha, and then he came over for the wedding, and then I flew to Canada with him. And at that point, imagine, I'm young, I'm a teenager. No one in our culture talks, at least in my family, talked about birth control or anything. So I became pregnant right away. I was literally given a crash course in birth control by my puppo the night before my wedding, which was all false information. So I became pregnant right away. I became a teenage mom. And now I'm in a new country as a young teen bride and a teen mom. And the only person that I know is him. So I'm completely and utterly dependent on him. I didn't even finish my high school. I didn't even finish my A-levels when I got married and went there. So now I can't even apply to universities because I don't have a high school. So now, one day when he was in a good mood, he took me to a regular high school in Canada, in Toronto. And the principal there was like, she saw me, I was visibly very pregnant, and beside this much older looking man, and she kind of put two and two together that he must be the husband. And then she said, I don't think you're going to fit into the student body in the school. And then she gave me a number to call, and that number was for Independent Learning Center, which is a center there where you can order your courses and you can sit at home and you can study on your own time. So when I called them, the person at the other end of the line, he said, he asked me how old I was, and I said I'm 18, and he's like, so why aren't you in like a regular school? And I said, it's kind of complicated. And then he said, well, most of the kids your age who are doing their courses through us rather than a regular school are kids who are in prison for whatever reason. And that's why they can't go to school. And I said to him, yeah, it's the same situation here. Because that's really what it was like. I was not allowed to go out of the house, make any friends, have any kind of independence, have any autonomy. And it was portrayed to me that it was for my own good because, the Western culture will corrupt you otherwise. लड़कियां यहाँ पे बाहर जाती हैं तो खराब हो जाती हैं, उनको हवा लग जाती है बाहर की, उनकी जुबानें निकल आती हैं, and all of that, right? So, like over the next several years, I was living with so much abuse, and at that time I didn't even know what to call it. I didn't even know it was abuse. There was a lot of verbal, har roz galiyan, and you're worthless, you're useless, which strips away at a person's self-esteem like nothing else. Like I was a hollow shell. Like I went from being a confident teenager, captain of girls cricket team in my school and founder of school newspaper and all of that, to suddenly being trapped in my home, feeding my baby. Like at night I used to like, study because that was my me time. Otherwise, pura din ke kaam, ghar ke, susral ke, and it wasn't just him, it was also his parents. We were all living in the same house. So wo pura susral ka pressure and all of that. And I was like simply like, in fact, my saas used to say to me that तुम्हें तो खुशी है, तुम्हें तो हमारा शुक्र अदा करना चाहिए कि हमने तुम्हें जो है ना लड़की के मकसद पे जल्दी पहुंचा दिया, तुम्हें वो पढ़ाई नहीं करनी पड़ी ज्यादा, as if like that's the only means, like the padhai was just the means to an end, and I should be grateful that I got to the real purpose. So there were so many degrees of violence. It started with emotional, and there was obviously financial, because financially I was utterly and completely dependent on him. There was a lot of psychological abuse, a lot of verbal abuse, and eventually, the bruises on your soul become so much that you start thinking that this is what I deserve, this is all, you start internalizing it. that, you know, maybe I am worthless, maybe I am useless, maybe I'm not worthy of love and respect, because that's what I'm told every single day. So when the bruises appear on your body, when the physical violence starts, you start believing that's your fault too. And, you know, that's the progression of abuse. It rarely ever starts with a slap or a kick. It starts with all these like underhanded compliments and jokes. And like, I often describe the progression of abuse with this analogy that, you know, if you put a frog in boiling water, the frog will jump out and run away. But if you put a frog in cold water and you heat the water like slowly, then the frog's body temperature keeps adjusting to the rising temperature of the water, and the frog will eventually boil to death without even realizing it. And that's what abuse looks like. So over the next 10 years, you know, I completely lost my sense of self. I was brutalized in a lot of ways. I was hit. I was, you know, I faced all kinds of abuse. But there was this one little sort of, I don't know, voice in my head that was, nahi, mujhe padhai nahi chhodni, kuch bhi ho jaye, mujhe padhai nahi chhodni. So I ordered all my courses through the Independent Learning Center. Raat ko ghar ke pure kaam din mein karke raat ko main padhti thi apne kamre mein, and I finished high school. Like, took me about 6 years to finish my high school courses. Then I applied to university, and then they refused to pay my university fee. And I couldn't get government support there for my fee because they look at household income, and his income was above the threshold. So then I was like, okay, ab mujhe khud kamana padega, lekin ghar se to bahar jane ki bhi ijazat nahi hai, main job kaise karu? So I started running a tuition and babysitting service in my home, and all my money would be taken away from me. Lekin main चुपके ना $100 $200 हर महीने साइड पे छुपाती रहती थी. And it took me another 3 years or so to save the $2,500 or so that I needed for my first year fee as a part-time student in university. Then applied to university again, got in, and this time I put my foot down because I was like, in my head, I was like, ab shuru karna hai. Beshak, I take only one course, I have to start. And I had some leverage because I said, okay, if you don't let me study, and if you don't let me start university, I will stop the daycare and the tuition. And they were already used to the additional income coming in. So I used that, but like uspe bhi bahut taane, and you know, acha ab to ye padhai karegi is umar mein, ab 2 bachchon ki maa hai, and you know, like main nahi bacche sambhal sakti iske, so I had to pay for my, you know, this was my saas who was saying that, so I had to pay for my kids like daycare as well, and all. But like, you know, again, what Maliha was saying, you know, earlier, that even if a woman wants to work, like there's so many other things that she has to take care of. So even the fact that I wanted to take simply one course in school, I had to make so many adjustments and so many sacrifices in order to do that, because it's not like, you know, because wo to yehi kehte hain na, haan theek hai, tumhe shauk hai to tum bhi khud karo, hum kyun tumhari madad kare, right? So they will try to put as many roadblocks in a woman's way as possible. And then when I started university, I was given very, very strict instructions. किसी से बात नहीं करना, class में हाथ नहीं उठाना, सवाल नहीं पूछना, because in other words, be invisible. Because again, abuse is about control, and the more isolated a woman is, the easier she is to control. So the whole point was to keep me as isolated as possible. So initially, I wouldn't talk to anyone. I would think I'm not worthy of conversation or engagement, so everybody will reject me, so I don't want to talk to anyone. But slowly, my walls started to crumble, and I started to raise my hand or raise my voice, and I was now suddenly being treated with respect and kindness for the very first time in my life. And for the very things that I was ridiculed all my life for, which were my intelligence and my ambitions and my autonomy and who I was as a person. And that is what suddenly, like, you know, changed my world. That am I this rock star that everybody at school seems to think I am? Or am I this worthless piece of scum stuck at the bottom of someone's shoe because that's how I'm being treated at home? And that's when, you know, in my one day, in my thoughts, I was walking on campus and I came across a sign, and it had a bunch of questions on it. Do you feel intimidated, like you've lost your voice, like you're living in fear, etc., etc. And it was as if the sign was calling to me. And it was the sign outside of the Health and Counseling Center on campus. And I went in and I made an appointment, and a few days later I was sitting across from my counselor, and the floodgates opened. उस वक्त तक तो मैंने किसी से बात ही नहीं की थी, और जो खानदान में अगर किसी से कुछ कहा भी था अपनी मॉम से या सास से या किसी से, तो सब मुझे ही चुप करने को कहते थे, right? So when I started to talk to the counselor, the floodgates opened, and I would say things like, you know, can you tell me what's wrong with me? Like, what is that secret to being a good wife that I cannot seem to understand? You know, do I need to cook better food or wash better clothes or keep the baby quieter at night or stay silent? Like, what do I need to do? And that's the first time anyone said to me, Samra, it's not your fault. You do not deserve to be abused. No one does. It took me another 2 years after that of going to counseling. I would skip class to go to counseling because he had kept a close eye on my schedule, and I didn't want to give him any kind of indication that I'm staying on campus later than I was supposed to. So I would skip class to go to counseling, and I would learn about abuse. I would learn that it was not my fault and it was not normal. And I have 2 daughters, and I didn't want them to grow up thinking this was normal. And then the cycle repeats itself. So when I left, finally, I was in my second year of bachelor's degree. And then, in my mind, already the financial and all that implication was a lot, because I didn't have a job. I hadn't even finished a degree. And, it was and the violence had escalated to a point where I couldn't stay any longer. Like, he had tried to kill me a couple of times. And at that point I had to leave. So I reported to the police and I left, and I moved to campus housing. I was working 5 jobs on campus, like TA, research assistant. I was even selling biryani to students from my little student housing apartment to make ends meet. And I would, do whatever I could to just keep things going one day at a time. But financially, it was extremely difficult. And in a lot of ways it was difficult. But what really, really hurt me the most is the cultural and family backlash that I faced. It was horrendous. I was sexually harassed because men thought now I'm damaged goods and used property, so I'm fair game. I was told that, I'm a shameless woman. I was a bad mother. I was an unfaithful wife. Like, my husband and his family spread rumors about me in the whole Pakistani community in Toronto that ye to kisi ke saath so rahi thi aur bhag gayi, and things like that. It was so horrible, even from my own family in Pakistan, and even over there, though, everybody that I knew was through his family. So everyone turned their backs on me. And when I eventually, like, I still kept going, and one day at a time. It was really hard. There were many days when I felt like I can't do it. Maybe everyone is right. I should go back. But that time, my older daughter, who was 8 or 9, she used to hold my hand and say, "Mom, you're not alone. We're with you. You're not going to go back. We're going to do this." So I kept taking it one day at a time, and I got support from my university and my professors, etc. And then eventually I graduated. And when I graduated, I was the top student in the entire University of Toronto. I won 17 awards and scholarships, went fully scholarship paid into my master's. And that's when I realized that, my story is not just mine. My story is very common, but my outcome was very rare. And I need to speak up. I cannot stay silent. And that's when I started to share my story. This was like 9 years ago, and over time it grew. And today, I'm sitting here in front of you, and I will always keep doing this work. But there's a few things that I have really, really taken to heart through all of this. Is like, it's like the no matter how much I achieve. I'm one of the top 100 most powerful women in Canada. I'm now studying at the top medical school in Canada to become a psychiatrist. I'm doing, a lot of great work. But what I hear from my family, like my brother-in-law called me a few years ago and said, क्या फायदा तुम्हारे awards और scholarships का जब तुम औरत के असल मकसद में fail हो गई? शर्म आनी चाहिए तुम्हें, right? The kind of stuff I face is like the backlash that I face for the work that I do, the hate messages, and sometimes even death threats. कि तुम औरतों को बहका रही हो, you're causing people's divorces. The sexual harassment, because again, you're used property. Something like, even things like, freedom for women is seen as bad because azad aurtein kharab aurtein hoti hain, right? So a lot of what Maliha and Nirmal were saying, but again, wrapping it up quickly, my relationship with myself is my metric of my honor. A woman's right to her freedom of choice, of living, of how she chooses to live. So I have been on a very long healing journey to break away from those patterns, those unconsciously ingrained patterns, to realize that the love that I give to myself is my benchmark of the love that I will receive from other people. And I don't need approval and acceptance from society or from anyone. Yes, it takes a lot of courage to walk away. And I've had to break off a lot of relationships, including with family, but it was a choice that I made because I'd rather be my own self and comfortable in my own skin than fitting into somebody's boxes to be accepted and loved, because accepted and loved for who we are is our fundamental birthright. And as the more and more women realize that, I think that is when, we'll start creating those shifts. Sorry, I took a long time, I know, but I wanted to make sure I hit all the points.
Okay, and thank you so much for sharing your story. You've talked a lot about it as well, but I'm sure every time that you talk about it, it is so difficult to, think about how it started from an early age and to break away from all of that, because it was ingrained, right? Like you were talking about, like you start to internalize all of that, that even though it is somebody else's fault, is it my fault? And it takes a long time to undo all of that. And I think it's also ingrained in our culture and our society because of the experiences that we have, and then our ancestors have, our parents have, and then our grandparents have. And it's very hard to break away from that cycle. And like you were saying, that your story is common, but the outcome is very uncommon. And so Nirmal, just very quickly, because I'm just aware that we are 3 already and we do have to wrap up. So I'll take one question from you and one from Maliha, and then we'll open up to the floor for maybe 5 minutes. Nirmal, I want to talk a little bit about intergenerational trauma, because what Maliha has said, what Samra said, there's a lot of that ingrained in us, right? So can you talk a little bit about intergenerational trauma and how it plays out into reinforcing these cultural expectations and this cultural toxicity, to be honest with you, how that gets in, just very quickly and briefly.
So intergenerational trauma, as the term implies, is the idea that बहुत अरसे से generation wise जो values and moral principles, supposed moral principles, आपकी दादा परदादा ने बना लिए और वही आप में pass down हो गए. सेक्सुअल आइडेंटिटी हो गई, सेक्सुअल कनेक्शन मेकिंग हो गई, इससे रिलेटेड बड़े क्लियर वैल्यूज हमारे कल्चर में मौजूद हैं जो कि जनरेशन पास ऑन हो गए. मतलब जब समरा बात कर रही है कि वो 18-17 साल की उम्र में उसकी फूफो ने एक रात पहले बड़ा क्विक रिव्यू उसको दिया, तो दिस इज वेरी कॉमन अमंगस्ट मेनी ऑफ पाकिस्तानी पॉपुलेशन के जहाँ पे सेक्स एजुकेशन से रिलेटेड कोई इन्फॉर्मेशन प्रेजेंट नहीं की जाती है, राइट्स, बॉडी राइट्स से रिलेटेड कोई इन्फॉर्मेशन प्रेजेंट नहीं की जाती. एंड दीज आर हेल्ड वैल्यूज, दीज आर वैल्यूज इनग्रेन्ड इन अस, दीज आर नॉट जस्ट कि कोई गलत काम हो रहा है. These are the moral principles according to which policies are also created, which basically means कि चूंकि हमारे दादा परदादा ने ये वैल्यू सेट की for whatever reasons, जो भी वजूहात रही, उसका impact policy government making level पे भी आ रहा होता है, right? So ultimately what starts to happen is कि जैसे समरा ने example दी कि her university professors and all that and environment, but पाकिस्तान में अगर हम policy intergenerational trauma से related associate कर रहे होते हैं ना, मैं अगर किसी नादरा के ऑफिस में अपना आइडेंटिटी कार्ड बनाने चली जाऊँ ना, माय ब्रदर, मतलब हस्बैंड, फादर, इन सब की आइडेंटिटी विल सुपरसीड मी जस्ट बेस्ड ऑन माय, लाइक मैं आइडेंटिटी कार्ड अपने नहीं बनवा सकती. अब इससे रिलेटेड अगर मैं कंप्लेन करूंगी अपने अब्बा से या अपनी अम्मा से, मेरी अम्मा इज लाइकली टू से कि तुम क्यों चिढ़ रही हो, अब्बा को ले जाओ ना, पापा को बोल दो कि ले जाओ. कॉमनली हैपेंस, हैज हैपेंड टू मी आल्सो, because my mom is carrying all that belief system as well. For her, this is not a potential of violation of my basic identity or right, but this is the norm. So intergenerational trauma बाज़ औक़ात manifest इस तरह से भी कर रहा होता है कि हम लोग अगर बोलते हैं कि अम्मा या अब्बा से तो सवाल ही नहीं पैदा होता, अम्मा मुझे इन्होंने गलत तरीके से टच किया, नहीं आप चुप कर जाएं, जैसा समरा आपने हाईलाइट किया कि बेटा आप दुपट्टा पहन लें, आपने दुपट्टा नहीं पहना हुआ था, ठीक है. सो जब हम बात करते हैं, I would say कि intergenerational values and intergenerational trauma, so ये values basically create करती हैं इस trauma potential को. So ये जो intergenerational normality के concept को लेके आया जा चुका होता है ना, वो आपके system को vulnerable बनाता है किसी भी अब की मौजूद बच्ची या औरत के लिए कि उसको किस तरह से violate किया जा सके. So my mother or my sister-in-law or my sister, while watching the news, is likely not to react with like a lot of shock when we talk about rape, when we talk about बहुत सारे incidences जो news में हो रहे थे, और खाने की टेबल पे बैठ के हमारी फैमिली उससे रिलेटेड बड़ी नॉर्मल तरीके से बात कर सकती है. उसको तोड़ना बहुत कम लोगों के लिए पॉसिबल हो रहा होता है. वो लोग जैसे समरा ने कहा कि उनकी अपनी सेल्फ से आइडेंटिटी की कोई पॉसिबिलिटी क्रिएट हो सकती है. So ultimately I would just like to highlight how intergenerational values can facilitate and basically highlight intergenerational trauma. That's the cycle.
Yeah. And so the trauma that our ancestors or people before
Have
us,
experienced,
before us
precisely.
have experienced and normalized and the way that they're reacting and the way that they're responding to that trauma gets passed down from one generation to another. And just one more thing that I'd like to add, that even if you as a woman have broken that cycle and have maybe not experienced that trauma, maybe your mom broke that cycle and protected you from that trauma, even though your mom or your grandmother might have experienced that trauma, can end up impacting your mental health still today because of everything that your people before you have experienced. So this inequality not just impacts the person who's experiencing
it,
but
precisely.
way after that. I know that we're kind of running out of time. So Maliha, I'd just like to take a quick question from you. I know we don't live in an ideal world, unfortunately. And so what must happen? What do we need to do? What needs to happen to dismantle the status quo so that we can create an equal and balanced world for all?
Okay, I think things have improved. Let's first of all do admit that, just and then try to end on a slightly more positive note, is that things are changing. But I think that what has to be done is already in process in talks such as today and hearing Samra's story and Nirmal's story and all of that, is that we should no longer stay silent. What historically has been done is that women's voices and narratives have been silenced. They're not allowed to speak and tell their story and their experiences. And until that happens, women's voices start framing the way our society should be, that's the only way to change. Because we have to start talking, admitting these things happen. Once we start admitting them, then we start slowly talking about everyone comes together. And then after that, the change has to happen. Because we have to start changing the society to suit what women and girls need and how to make sure that's equal. So if anything, I would just say is don't be silent anymore. Talk about your story, however small, however big. If not, people may not believe us, family members may not believe us, but there is someone who will believe us. There is someone who will validate it, because no one is alone. And unfortunately, none of us have the experiences that we have might be unique to us, but we are not the only ones to experience something similar. So talk about it, talk about it, talk about it, and share with someone, because there's somebody out there who will need you to say what you've been through. And only then can we slowly start demanding the changes that we need.
Absolutely. I will just add one line to what Maliha said, that there is no honor in silence. There is absolutely no honor in silence. And silence is the first step to creating some change. And I think also like more and more men need to be allies in this fight, because that's how we'll it's not a men versus women issue. So anyway, I just wanted to add
absolutely
that.
You're so right, Samra and Maliha, that we need to start speaking up. And Samra, like you highlighted, more men need to start giving a platform to our voices and amplifying our voices and actually hearing our stories out, hearing the stories of women, girls, vulnerable groups who've experienced inequality, who've experienced violence, who've experienced gender-based violence, to give a platform and to amplify their voices. And I really wish that there were, I don't see even maybe one man who's here, or maybe two. So the man who is here, thank you for being here to hear our stories and to hear our voices. And I really wish that there were more men, and hopefully on Facebook there are more men who are listening. We will just take one or two questions from the audience if there are any. I know that we're over time, but Maria, that is a question that's outside of our panel today. And if you have a question around how BBHS is catering to teachers' mental well-being, I'll be more than happy to discuss that on a different platform. But I did want to give some time to the audience to ask our panelists some questions if there are any. If not, then we will end for today. I'm just going to see if there are any in the question box. Give me 1 second, please. Okay, so we don't have any questions. I just wanted to summarize what we've talked about today. I think, Samra, from what you were saying and from the story that you were telling and the experiences that you've told us today, it sounds like a very isolating experience. And I think that is how inequality, one of the ways that inequality gets perpetuated is that the person is isolated so much that they have no access to a support system, that they have no platform to be able to ask for help. And they start to internalize all of the abuse, all of the inequality that they've experienced, and they start blaming themselves for it, or they start holding themselves accountable for it. And so I hope that this has been really helpful for everyone that's been listening. I hope that encourages more women, more girls to speak out and share their stories. Once again, I would like to thank our panelists today, Samra, Nirmal, Maliha. Thank you so much for sharing your expertise, your knowledge, and more importantly, your own lived experiences and sharing your real stories with us today. Just wanted to add that we've got a second segment on men's mental health, how patriarchy and toxic expectations reinforce that and impact men's mental health at 3:30 today. So please do tune in and we will all see you there. Thank you so much, everyone. Thank you for tuning in. Allah Hafiz. Bye. Yes, so everyone who's still here, we have put the link to the next segment on patriarchy and toxic expectations. You can just click on the link to join that, that segment. It will start at 3:30 p.m. For more information about Bayview High School and the Emotional Wellbeing Department, we've put the website on there. You can follow that and learn more. Thank you so much, and I hope that I will see you all at the next segment. Allah Hafiz, everyone.